Welcome, everyone. I am John Slade, giving the third of my pop culture lectures. The first one was on Godzilla and its original meaning. The second one was on Saturday morning cartoons, what happened to them, where they came from, and how they got to be as big as they were. And then they disappeared. And this third one that you're here today is on Star Wars. It was always left-wing propaganda. It always started out that way. And quite frankly, when people talk about it today like it's too politically correct, there's too many black people running around with lightsabers in it, it is to laugh. However, I'm going to give them a scintilla of the benefit of the doubt, because that first Star Wars film ever made might have threw you, but not too much. All right, but first, I know a lot of people like to be cinephiles and so forth and talk about the origins of Star Wars and where it came from, usually pertaining to a Japanese film by Akira Kurosawa called The Hidden Fortress, which is pretty much the same script as the original Star Wars. A feisty princess, a stranger who knows the ways of the samurai, and two hilarious guys who are bungling their way through the entire adventure. And instead of where are the plans to the Death Star, it's where is the gold? They're looking for gold. They're walking through the entire enemy territory with gold disguised as just simple firewood. How long can they keep the ruse up? Until they're caught. Because the princess is trying to save her land, and she needs that gold to finance it. So it's an interesting movie. But that's the cinephile explanation as to where Star Wars came from. I'm going to go differently. I'm going to go back to the 1960s, not the 1950s of an old movie from Japan. No, the 1960s and television. Television was reaching its peak. Started out in 1948 with like maybe 10 million viewers in and around the Northeast Corridor and other parts of the country, Chicago, Los Angeles. But by the 1960s, every house had a television. Even if it was an old Magnavox they bought in 1959. In fact, people were watching black and white TV until the black and white TVs conked out and they had to buy a color television. That was as late as 1980. My mother had an old black and white TV. She was quite content to look at it. She didn't need the color. She had it. She saw it. Now I don't need it. So you'd be surprised. Now, the 1960s, specifically, prime time television, which is television from like 7 to 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, to us 7 to 10. That's when all the shows come on that get a big audience, because most people are watching from that time. So, realizing that the audiences are getting bigger, the voracious need for programming was still an issue. So in 1963, an anthology series comes on called Outer Limits, which was far more overt in its science fiction than Twilight Zone, which dabbled in fantasy, soft stuff, and was a half hour. But this was an hour, a lot of science fiction, a monster of the week, and a lesson at the end, because it was trying to teach you something. TV had this thing about we have to have redeeming social value. Even if we shoot 50 people in an hour, we must have redeeming social value. Okay? So, Outer Limits comes on, makes a bit of a splash. Does okay, gets renewed. Then, another show comes on in a season after. That was 63, this is 64. Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, about the nuclear submarine sea view, and it would go into the depths and battle monsters. The thing about that was that it was a television show with a continuing cast that was not an anthology like Twilight Zone or Outer Limits. We could prove that people would come in to see a character each week, have absurd adventures, and then come back the next week. Then, a season later, 1965, Lost in Space comes on with the robot Dr. Smith and the space family Robinson. Now, these shows were getting what are known as ratings points. That means at least an excess of 22 million people a week are watching these shows. That's, in those days, that was the magic number to stay on the air, if you could get over 20 million people. You get 20 million, you get 18, you're on the bubble, you're probably going to get canceled. The standards were way higher. When we said a mass audience, we meant a mass audience. And then in 1966 comes on the seminal Star Trek with the interracial crew, Lieutenant Uhura, Mr. Sulu, Spock, and Captain Kirk et al., and Dr. McCoy, the homespun Southerner. Yes, I do believe Dr. McCoy was a Southerner. A modern one, okay? And again, Star Trek was always on the bubble. That's why it lumbered through 3 seasons. And then on the same season, just the day after Star Trek, came on Time Tunnel, which was a show on ABC. Came on right after The Green Hornet. I know because I was 10 years old and that was my night. Friday night was my night to watch stuff. So these science fiction shows had become so popular that it was time for even comedy to get into it. CBS premiered another science fiction show in 1966, a thing called It's About Time, It's About Space, about 2 astronauts that were trapped back in time with cavemen and dinosaurs. Totally played for laughs, a la Gilligan's Island. I watched that thing. I thought that was a scream. To me, at the age of 9, that was absolutely high comedy. With a science fiction theme under it, okay, I'm for it. This, in the 1960s, again, ending up the decade in 1968 with Land of the Giants. I have a soft spot for Land of the Giants because it's the first television show before Roots that showed the adventures of people trying to live in a racist society that hates them for what they are. Even though it was totally goofy and wild and crazy. But that's how you get away with stuff back in those days, before black people could come on TV and actually say things like Good Times or Roots. You always had to disguise it with puppets and monsters and aliens and zap guns. And science fiction had a tendency to do that. Well, these shows were getting huge audiences. When I say 22, it might be 29. Lost in Space was getting 29 million people a week to watch the antics of Dr. Smith and the robot. They were pulling in audiences, and networks said, okay, we'll keep trying this stuff until people get tired of it. So it had an echo effect through the 70s. The Bionic Man and the Bionic Woman were 70s things. Battlestar Galactica was a 70s show. So the echo continued. Now I say the 1960s because millions of people were watching this every week. So I would say we're talking eyeballs altogether on each show. At the height, the 1966 to 67 season, we might have had maybe 50, 60 million people looking at this stuff. On and off, round and round. So I say that because a lot of people were kids like me. Some of them were older, like my brother. They would watch some of this stuff. Occasionally, my Lost in Space was a family show in my house. My brother, sister, and I and mother would watch this thing just to see the antics of Dr. Smith get in trouble again. This was big. And everybody remembered that. So I say that is more important than the hidden fortress in the genesis of Star Wars. Because all those people remembered that stuff. So when they were 20 or 30 in 1977, and this little movie comes out called Star Wars, it clicked in all kinds of ways. Now, Star Trek had an evil Klingon empire and a mysterious Romulan empire. So the word empire had already been put in people's minds. Oh, they got an empire on this thing. Okay. R2-D2 and C-3PO are the exact same sketch as Dr. Smith and the robot on Lost in Space with the constant back and forth bickering. Oh, that's familiar. Yeah, I'm ready for that. You know? The faster than light drives, the handled technology. It was all familiar to millions of people who remembered that stuff. Even though Star Wars was not a Lost in Space movie or a Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea movie or a Star Trek film. That would come later. But Star Wars got all of this stuff, put it in itself. So it was very familiar. Yes, they even use words on Star Wars like cloaking device. Oh, I remember that from Star Trek. You don't have to explain what it is anymore because you'd gone to school in the 1960s. Plus the fact that these shows, I'm telling you, reran through the 70s, the refresher course. Now, that's to me the real genesis of the success of Star Wars. Why people stood in line. Why I myself was irritated as heck to have to stand in line. What are you doing here? This is a science fiction thing. This isn't a disaster movie. This isn't Love Story. This isn't the movie with the rats. Y'all don't remember the movie with the rats. Willard? Remember Willard? Yeah. Movie with the rats, you know. Ernest Borgnine, yes. So we have this going on. But now it's time to get into the deep essence of Star Wars and what it was. And the title of this, of course, is Star Wars was always left-wing propaganda. George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, who did American Graffiti. You like the music from the 50s? That's your movie. He came out of film school. But his generation, he was in his 20s then, hated the Vietnam War and what it had done. It's not impossible for older baby boomers to say, I lost a friend in Vietnam. It's not impossible. A school chum, I went to elementary school. My own brother will tell me about the friends that he stood to catch the bus with to go to Maurice Couvent. How they were gone in Vietnam. Like there's a picture, I think they had a picture of him in our albums. And he says, that guy's gone, he died in Vietnam, he died in Vietnam, that guy died in Vietnam. My brother didn't because the military didn't want him. He wasn't a perfect specimen. You know, but what I'm saying is, you compound that with George Lucas's being in that baby boomer era and the huge controversy and political strife that the Vietnam War caused, even to the point of shooting students to death at Kent State and Jackson State, which is never mentioned in the same words as Kent State, but I always do, because they happened mere days apart. Student protests, and my mother told me those kids never even dreamed that because they were protesting that they were going to get killed. Never dreamed that that would happen because they were protesting in this country. But yes, it happened in this country. So Lucas coming up through all of that, and it's quite possible he knew people he went to school with who died in Vietnam, and it turned out to be such a stinkeroo funk, a worthless war for no good reason. He was enraged, and so he wanted to make a movie that would put that rage on screen. Now you might think he might try to do something like Platoon from Oliver Stone. Nah. No, he's going to make a movie. It's going to be a science fiction movie so I can say the things I want to say without getting yelled at too loudly. So yes, Star Wars is actually about the 60s radical left rebellion, going from civil rights, freedom riders, all the way to kids at Kent State, all the way to anti-war protests, women's lib protests, and everything. All the rage of rebellion against the oppressive state. And of course, who can forget the Black Panthers saying that we hope to overthrow the United States government. There also was the Weather Underground. That was the left-wing terrorist group. The blowing up of ROTC buildings. Hijacking of airplanes. Terror was a regular thing in the 60s. Especially from the state to everybody else, from spying, suspected, what do they call that, COINTELPRO, and all that sort of thing. So Lucas has got to say something about that. So, and to buttress this, when Return of the Jedi came out in 1983, the 4th, 5th, 6th chapter of Star Wars, the Ewoks. George Lucas said the Ewoks are like the Viet Cong. They're going to take on a high-tech government and take it down. He said this. It's in Time magazine. I think I got the issue.